We are starting a new series this weekend on the issue of blessing. It'll be 10 weeks long. It'll wrap it up there right after Thanksgiving weekend. And I want to talk to you about this idea of blessing. A blessing is a concept that we use a lot. Somebody sneezes, we say, God bless you. If you're from the South and someone says to you, oh, bless your heart, that's not a good thing. That means you're kind of a dope and you don't know what you're talking about. And so we have pity on you. And we so quickly say, oh, we put the signs up, bless our home and all that, often not recognizing really how deep and rich and true the concept, the biblical concept of blessing is. And so over the next few weeks, we're going to take a look at this concept of blessing, a study titled, The Life God Blesses. We're going to see if we can't discover some truth that we can apply into our lives to be in pursuit of the blessing that God promises to us. It's about a generation ago now that Marjorie Collar wrote a book called That's Good. No, That's Bad. Great story. It's a children's story. Sort of aims for about the 4-year-old to the 6, 7-year-old. And it's the story of a family that goes to the zoo. And at the zoo, they buy their 4-year-old son a big red balloon that's helium-filled, and when he gets a hold of it, the balloon lifts him out of the zoo, and he goes miles and miles until he finally gets into the jungle. And in the jungle, the balloon strikes a tree and pops, and he falls down into the river, and that's bad. Except that really that's good, because in the river he finds a hippo that befriends him and takes him safely to shore where he's safe, and that's good. But no, that's bad, because on shore are 10 bad baboons wanting to play. And he's afraid of them because they're just wild and crazy. And so he runs and he begins to climb up a tree and he grabs onto a vine, and that's good. He can escape. Except that's bad, because the vine turns out to be the tail of a venomous snake, and that's bad. Except really it's good, because when he lets go of this, he falls and tumbles down onto the back of a giraffe. Whee! Slides down the giraffe's back and lands on the ground safely, and that's good. Except really that's bad, because where he lands is in the lap of a sleeping lion. And that's bad. Except really that's good, because the lion befriends him and puts him up on his back, and he gets to gallop to the very edge of the jungle where he is laid down away from the lion, and he's kind of sad and he begins to cry, and that's bad. But really, no, that's good, because a stork hears him crying and circles down and picks him up and takes him all the way back to the zoo where his family is waiting, and that's good. And that's actually great, because the stork drops him into his father's arms. Great story, great children's book that sort of tells that story. Here's the reality. One of the reasons why that storybook resonates with me is because that's often how we see life. How do we know if the next thing for us is good or bad? How do we know if the vine we reach toward, hoping to get relief from the pressure we feel, might not turn out to be the tail of a venomous snake? So often you and I look at our daily lives, or we look at the immediacy of our situation, and we think that's bad. And not until the retrospective of several years, we can look back and we say, no, that's good. You and I will find, God willing, during this study of the Scriptures over the next several weeks, that some of our darkest jungle moments, some of our breathless plunges into the water, will be, from the perspective of years, the time of greatest blessing in our lives. I can testify from my own life, my own experience, that God has done more to shape me and in the long run bless my life and my family in the times of difficulty or uncertainty or the mundane sort of day-to-day challenges of life than He ever did on the mountaintop experiences that I've had. We evaluate blessing with sunny days, cool wind, and money in our pocket. And it may be that those very things are the things that will distract us from the God who holds forth the promise of His blessing to His people. So over these next 10 weeks, we're going to, this morning, introduce the topic of blessing. And in the weeks to come, one Old Testament character per week we'll see illustrated in their lives how God has brought blessing to bear in their life. In fact, let me just, by way of preview, give you the topics we'll cover. What is the life God blesses? What is it in the midst of my uncertainty or in the midst of my good times can I expect that God will put His smile of blessing upon? God blesses faith. We'll see this next week in the life of Abraham. We'll introduce it this week, but we'll see the full story next week. How God blesses those who trust Him and His character, and by faith place their trust in Him. God blesses obedience. Time and again, we will see illustrated in the Old Testament the truth that when I trust God enough to obey Him, that opens the door for God's blessing in my life. God blesses dependence. What I mean by that is when I find myself in a place of weakness or uncertainty or need or inexplicably without the answers I'm seeking, and I have the option of sort of pressing through in my own wisdom or handling that with an open hand and say, God, I am dependent upon you. We will find that the place of God's blessing is that place of dependence. That thing that so often you and I hate. I don't want to be dependent on others. I don't want to not know. God will bring His blessing to bear in a time of dependence. God blesses integrity. When we are challenged to cut corners, when the pressure is on to shade the truth, when the numbers have to be met and the quarterly report is due and we are told to just lie to make it look good and we stand on integrity, we will find the truth of Proverbs 18:10. The man of integrity walks securely because there God brings His blessing. We'll see that illustrated time and again in the Old Testament. God blesses, and I just couldn't think of a better word than this, God blesses grit. I don't mean the kind our kids bring in on their shoes, the carpet. Perseverance is maybe a synonym, but perseverance can at times have the sort of idea of cold, grim duty. That is not the biblical concept of perseverance. Perseverance is such a deep, abiding trust in the promises of God that I can endure, I can persevere with joy, hope, and purpose because I know God will bless that obedience. And I'm going to just title it Grit. We will see again Old Testament example of God blessing time and time and time again those who live with grit. Courage. If grit is the external expression of obedience in the face of uncertainty or pushback, courage is the inner set of the soul that drives us to grit. God blesses the courage of His people. God, give us in this generation where nothing seems to matter, men and women of conviction who will stand on courage. Courage drives 3 young men in the face of pressure to bow down to the image of the king in the face of a fiery furnace. It drives them to say, we will obey God rather than man. And they will triumph in the place of God's blessing. Courage drives an old man named Daniel who had a track record of success and a track record of faithfulness. When the last push came, you don't pray or there's a lion's den for you. Courage motivates Daniel to open his windows and kneel down on his knees and pray to the God of heaven who delivered him from the lion's den. God will bless when His people courageously follow Him in the face of adversity, in the face of pushback, in the face of negative peer pressure. God give us students in our colleges, in our schools, and moms and dad who have courage of their faith. And see the difference that doesn't make in the lives of the believer because it brings God's blessing. God blesses loyalty. I will do the right thing. I will not turn my back on my commitment to Jesus Christ, even in the face of pressure, even in my family. Even when the external temptation is strong and my resistance is weak, I will recognize that the blessing of God comes when I demonstrate loyalty, and He will smile upon that. God blesses generosity. God created the world to reflect His own generosity. You and I plant one seed and we reap an entire harvest of fruit. That's how God designed the world. God also designed His people that way. You will recognize that the more that we reflect God's generous blessing in our lives, the more God enables us to be blessed and to bless others. You cannot fill a closed hand, one grasped with greed. But God says, open your hand and I will fill it to the point of overflowing. We'll learn that God blesses generosity. Well, let's talk about blessing. So this morning, by way of introduction, let's talk about blessing. The word bless, blessed, blesses, blessing occurs 544 times in the English Standard Version translation of the Bible. The root is a concept that is so fundamental to the Scriptures, we've got to get a handle on it. Genesis chapter 1, verses 22 and 28. God creates an entire world, perfection, beauty, order, structure out of chaos. And He speaks a benediction. And God blessed it. In verse 28, He creates man and woman, and God blessed them. Revelation chapter 22, the very last chapter of the Bible. Interestingly, in Genesis chapter 1, the first chapter of the Bible, there are two spoken blessings. You get to Revelation chapter 22, the last chapter of the Bible, and there are two spoken blessings. As though God is saying, let me put a bookend so you understand from Genesis past to Revelation future, blessing is my plan for my people. Let me see if I can give us a working definition. Scott, when you talk about God's blessing, what are you talking about? What might that look like? Well, let me give you the biblical definition of blessing. To bless is to speak or bring good favor. To cause to prosper. To bring beneficial power. To enlarge. To make happy. Blessing is a good thing. There are, what's the word we should use? There are 3 traffic jams of blessing in the Scriptures. What's a traffic jam? Well, you've been on the Eisenhower, you see the Hillside Triangle where all the roads kind of come together, and even though they spent $1 billion 10 years ago to widen it, they're still there. So in the Scriptures, there are 3 places where blessings sort of come together. The first, as I referenced, is the book of Genesis. I love that because it's the book of beginnings. It's the book of promise. Look what I've created. Look how great it is. And in the face of that blessing, do you remember what our first parents did? They turned, they disobeyed, they ran, and what did they do? They hid. And God pronounced a curse. Now, by that I don't mean He said bad words. He spoke condemnation over that creation. And because of our parents' first choices, our tendencies and our own choices, life can be very hard, and God can seem far away. But you know what happens the rest of Genesis? The entire rest of the book is about undoing that. And God blesses Abraham. God blesses Noah. God blesses Abraham's son Isaac. God blesses his grandson Jacob. God blesses his great-grandson Joseph. Over and over again, one of the most common places in the Bible where you're going to find blessing is Genesis. I love that because it's a forward-looking promise. The foolish disobedience, the sin of our first parents, and all that's recorded in Genesis does not undo God's promise and His plan to bless this world. And so there's a second confluence of blessing, a second place where the traffic gets a little bit thick in the Scriptures, and that is the book of Psalms. What I love about the book of Psalms is it's written from a much later perspective than the book of Genesis, and it's retrospective, it's looking back. It's surveying so often the history of God's interaction with this world, and specifically with His people, and saying, "Bless the Lord, O my soul. All that is within me, bless His holy name." Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits. And the whole Psalm 103 lists all that God has done, as though God's people in the midst of turmoil and often disappointment can look back and say, but God, in the midst of that fallenness, has blessed us. But still in the Psalms, it feels incomplete. There's still a looking forward. And so the third intersection, where there's an awful lot of traffic when it comes to this issue of blessing, unsurprisingly, is the ministry of Jesus Christ. He came to fulfill all of the promises of God. In him, all the promises of God are yes, and in him they're amen. So that Jesus began his first and best known message, Matthew 5. Blessed are thee, and 8 times he pronounces a blessing, literally happiness, on his people. And then he lives a 3-year ministry filled of blessing people. The deaf hear, the lame are healed, the dead come alive, and they crucify him for that. And he rises again, and he calls his first followers outside the city of Jerusalem, and he raises his hands and begins to ascend to glory, where he'll return one day. We look for that hope. It's called the, by the way, blessed hope. Luke 24:50. Jesus raised his hands, he began to ascend, and as he went, you know what he did to his followers? He blessed them. Jesus speaks blessing. Just to make sure we get it, the last chapter of the last book of the Bible, Revelation, as I mentioned, twice pronounces a blessing on his people, and in fact pronounces a blessing on all who would read and benefit from the truth of the Scriptures. God blesses. His desire is that his people live in the face of, the knowledge of, and the benefit of his blessing. So take your Bibles, turn to Genesis chapter 12. Just a down payment this morning, just the introduction to what will follow. Let's take a look at God's call of Abram and the blessing he promised. While you're turning to Genesis, it's the first book of the Bible, chapter 12. Can I just be honest with you, tell you, what am I looking for out of this message series? I want a group of people who have such a clear vision in their mind of the blessings God provides for his people that, quite honestly, we are not content where we are. And like Abraham and so many men and women throughout the Scriptures whose lives we'll examine, we have a deep hunger for the blessing of God in our lives. We will be so rooted in our trust of God that when his blessing comes wrapped up in dark clouds and need, we are not shaken by that. And we can trust him in the dark. Genesis chapter 12, whenever you get into the middle of a book, you're jumping into the middle of a stream of narrative, so we're coming into the middle of a story. Genesis chapters 1 through 11, 5 times God pronounces a curse. I mean, there's some negativity there. That's in response to the human tendency to go their own way. Genesis chapter 12, we have a narrowing of the focus from the entire world to what God's going to do in the life of one family. And through that family, what he's going to do in the entire world by way of redemption. So Genesis 12, verse 1. Now, the Lord had said to Abram, now his name will later be changed to Abraham. He's a mighty father. But here it's just Abram. Still a good name, but God will later change that after he blesses him. And the Lord has said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. Did you count how many times he uses the word blessed or blessing? What do you think the answer is? What do you think the answer is? How many times had God cursed until now? 5. God is undoing the consequence of human sinfulness. And He's beginning that process in the person of Abram. And here's what He says to Abram. You leave the familiar that you know. Abram was living in Haran. It was a big business capital north of Israel. His father, Terah, had taken him there and established the family business there. And Abram was prospering there. And God says, Abram, leave what you know, that which you depend upon for your well-being, leave that, and you follow me, you trust my promises, and I will take care of you. Does that sound familiar? Didn't Jesus say something very similar? To follow Him. God is beginning in Abram what He will complete in Jesus Christ, the redemption of the race, and it begins with blessing. What Abraham's response is to follow. God will bless Abraham and his children, and his children's children, and his children's children's children, until we get to the very end of Genesis chapter 50, and it's all blessings. As though God is saying, I will continually bless my people. So, what do we say about blessing? Let me give us 3 takeaways today. Maybe 3 to-dos, because I hope by now you're interested in saying, there's something about this blessing makes sense. I want to be a part of that. How do I get on the blessing wagon? I want to be on that. And so let me give us 3 truths that come out of this sort of this broad scope of blessing. The first is this: blessing flows from God. Stay close. Blessing flows from God. Stay close. The ancient world in particular, blessing was thought to be a magical incantation. If I can say the magic words, if I can get my God to be on my side, I'll say a magic blessing and your life will be well. The Old Testament puts the lie to that. Helps to debunk the superstition so many people have about the idea of a blessing or of cursing. Because time and again, the most basic truth of a blessing is this: where God is, He brings blessing. Here is something I have observed in the lives of His people. This is true all throughout history, but I've seen it in the lives of folks, even those at our church. It's a tendency I've had to fight in my own life, and it's this. In times of difficulty, times of sin, times of conflict, times we would be looking for the blessing of God and asking for it to help us through, our tendency is to withdraw. Who's not here this morning? Now, I'm not talking about folks I know they travel or people are on vacation, they're gone. I totally get that. But if you could just interact with folks of this congregation as I do, you would realize how often it's common that people say, I'm just not going to be around for a while. And as though they run faster and faster away from the God who says, I've got the blessing, you need to be near to me. At the close of this message, I'm going to pray over you the blessing of Ephesians chapter 1. The short version is simply this: God has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in Christ. And the nearer we find ourselves to God, the more clearly we understand He is blessing there. Some of you have been fighting the battle of saying, you know what? I'm not going to be a part of this anymore. Maybe the focus is on someone else who's done you wrong in your perception. Perhaps they have done you wrong, really. Or disappointment, or failure, or sin. Do you remember Adam and Eve's first response to sin? You remember what they did? They covered their nakedness and they hid. When all along in the very garden itself was their Creator God saying, Adam and Eve, where are you? Will we choose to fight the tendency to withdraw? So that the very time I need the blessing of God the most for restoration and help and sustenance, I decide I'll just try this on my own, thank you very much. And it can actually lead us to that place of saying, well, where's God at anyway? And the bitterness and the resentment begins to rise. Run toward and not away from God. because blessing flows from God. Stay close. You don't have to turn here, but it's interesting what Abraham's grandson Jacob found. Jacob, one of two twins, but he had the misfortune of being born second. So his older brother Esau would gain all of the family inheritance, or at least 2/3 of it, and he would have the controlling interest in the family business. And he would be the authority figure. Except God stepped in and said, I want you to know I'm going to bless Jacob more than I'm going to bless Esau. In fact, Jacob, the secondborn, will actually serve as the firstborn. He will be the one to get the blessing. And I think Jacob and his mother sort of thought about that because in a very unfortunate choice, decades later, Jacob deceives his father, Isaac. I don't know if he just got impatient with God doing his promises or not, but Isaac is blinded by his old age, and Jacob comes in and he tricks his dad into blessing him, promoting him to the head of the family business, giving him all the inheritance and all of that. And his older brother Esau, his twin, comes in just a few moments later, finds out what's happened, and in a rage swears, I will kill my brother. Thereby he gets all the inheritance. And that shortcutting of God's promise drove Jacob to run away. He would spend the next 20 years on the run from his own actions, away from the very land God promised to bless him in. And he got this really unhealthy relationship with his uncle Laban. Works for him, he marries his daughter, and in a really unhealthy situation, he marries another wife, and all kinds of chaos that ensues. There's people trying to take advantage of others and ripping them off, and to the point that after 20 years, Jacob once again flees, this time back towards home, away from Uncle Laban. Jacob's name literally means grab a hold of the heel, trip somebody up, trick them, deceive them. He's done that for his entire life, including the very way he thought he would get the blessing of God. It's not until 20 years later, on his way back south, where he is going back home to the promised land, that God said, I will bless you here. That he has the experience of Genesis chapter 32, verse 22. Jacob arose during the night. He sends all of the caravan ahead of him. Verse 24 says this, Genesis 32:24. And Jacob was left alone. Don't miss that. That's where his conniving had gotten him. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. God, in some way or another, we're not sure entirely how this happened, God, in human form, confronts Jacob. And Jacob recognizes something about the divine nature of this man, this being. And verse 25, verse 24 is wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. Verse 25, when the man saw he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket. Jacob's hip was put out of joint, and he wrestled with him. And he said, that is the man who was wrestling, he said, let me go, for the day is broken. Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you, what's he say? Unless you bless me. And he said to him, what is your name? My name is Jacob. He replied, think about it. My name is Trickster, Deceiver. Then he said, your name shall no longer be Trickster, but wrestler with God. That's what Israel means. For, end of verse 28, you have striven with God and with man and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you seek my name, or you ask my name? Hey, I've given you your name. You don't need to know my name. And look at the end of verse 29. For 20 years, this is what Jacob has wanted. And in the breaking dawn of a restless night, having wrestled with God, and he blessed him. Now, verse 30, Jacob called the name of that place Peniel, saying, For I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been delivered. And the sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, limping because of his hip, and therefore to this day the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh. Blessings flow from God. Stay close. Let me ask us two questions related to Jacob's experience. When was the last time you and I were so convinced and hungry for the blessing of God that we wrestled until we got it? Some of you, God put in your heart to accomplish something. Maybe that was 20 years ago. Maybe it was last week. And you have found the way to be hard. And you have found at times when you try, it doesn't turn out the way you want, and maybe you're very far away from your goal. Why did you give up? Why not turn back to God? Why not wrestle with Him through the night as necessary until God blesses that thing that you have in your heart? Second question that follows out of that is this. Am I willing to limp if I can be close to God and experience His blessing? For the rest of his life, Jacob will be marked by that night of wrestling until he got the blessing of God. And the blessing of God in Jacob's life resulted in a permanent limp. You and I want the easy path. We want to be whole. So often we will recognize it is in wrestling God and walking with the limp that His blessing is found. Why would we equate full health, full wallets, the job we love, as the blessing of God? Are you willing to stay close to God in pursuit of His blessing if that results in a limp? Serious questions when we talk about the blessing of God. Second thing that's true about the blessing of God, blessing invites trust. Believe. Blessing invites trust. Believe. Abraham believed God, and he left, and he went to the place God showed him. Jacob believed God, and he went back home to the place God had given him. Joseph trusted God, and in the place of the jail, he was extremely blessed and successful. Do we trust? When I originally wrote the notes, I had down blessing demands trust. What I mean by that is if we're going to find God's blessing, we're going to have to be in a place of trust. We have to trust that His Word is true. But I don't think it's the quite right turn of phrase. Inviting, I think, captures it better because of this. God holds blessing. Wherever He is, there's blessing. And He invites us and says, see, child of God, all this for you, come close. I don't think it's a demand. I think from God's perspective, it's an invitation. April of 1995, my hometown, I'd been a pastor to students for 7 years, growing, thriving church, and I had a good conversation with the pastor I served with, and we just kind of saw what God was doing in my life and the growth I've had personally, and was getting on time to probably step out into another ministry and maybe be a lead pastor somewhere. And I went home, I talked to Vicki about that night, and she said no and started crying. This was our hometown. My mother lived in our home with us. We had bought and renovated my grandmother's home. So my memories as a kid going to Grandma's house, I lived them again as an adult. We had 2 toddlers. Vicky's parents lived in the same hometown frequently on Sunday night after services. How many of you guys grew up in a church where you had Sunday night church? Any of you? A few of you? Did you go? Yeah, somebody. Wow, you guys are really dedicated. So after Sunday night church, Vicki and I would go and see Grandma and Grandpa with the kids. Great life. But God was just doing something about calling me to serve. And so in March of 1996, The 31-year-old with just those young kids, 2 and a 4-year-old. We left and we drove. I remember crossing the Skyway, coming into to Illinois, going to Melrose Park, and got a ticket on the way. That was quite a welcome. Welcome to Chicago. Thank you for that. And it was hard. It was unfamiliar. And probably not until I see the perspective of these 20, nearly 21 years later, do I recognize God had such great blessing in my life, my wife's life. And if we didn't trust that God would do something totally unexpected, and that is for sure the case, we never would have packed the U-Haul. Never would have crossed the Skyway. Don't give up. Trust in your heart, in your soul. Because His blessing invites that you'll trust Him. And I will say to you, I am absolutely convinced that the greatest blessings in my life personally, in our family, and in the life of this church probably lie 20 years ahead of us. And I can't wait for that ride. Third thing about blessing. Blessing follows obedience. Obey. Blessing follows obedience. Obey. Follow-up question for us is this. Do I trust God enough to persevere, to obey on my job, in my marriage, with my children, through an illness? Some right now, you may be sitting here, you may be watching online, you may be saying, you know what, right now the thing I want more than anything is just to be myself, to get away from my responsibilities, to get relief from all this pressure. And God has called us to obey, to have such a deep well of trust that we can believe the greatest place of God's blessing is the place I am now, even though I don't see it right now. Will you have the faith to obey, even when that obedience in the short term in particular leads to more trouble? Ask Joseph about obedience. Ask Daniel and the 3 Hebrew children about obedience. Ask Jesus, who was obedient to the point of death, for the joy that was before him endured the cross. Here's how we're going to close the service today. I'm going to invite the worship team back up. Maybe no one has experienced this sense of trusting and being obedient in the midst of hardship more than Job. Job, successful businessman, wonderful family man, lost it all in a matter of days. 42 chapters in the book of Job. For 42 chapters, rolls out over weeks and months. It's a story of losing everything precious to him. And years go by, and there is no explanation included in Job. He doesn't ever know what happened or why. But when you get to Job chapter 42, from the perspective of literally decades later, here's the summary of Job's life. And the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning. Let me be honest with you. I want that written about me. The Lord blessed the latter days of Scott more than his beginning. I want that. And then the book closes this way. And Job died an old man, full of days. I don't think that only means that he had lots of days. I think he had lots of full days. I want that written about me too. You and I, in a flat-out, selling out to pursue the blessing of God, will live and die and have said about us, God blessed their latter days more than their beginning. And they died full of days.